Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on setting a science-based target for the energy and utilities sector. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's webinar. You've joined the presentation listening using your computer speaker system by default. If you prefer to join over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit your questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. You can send in your questions at any time during the presentation, and we will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end or afterwards via email. I would now like to introduce today's first presenter, Steve Kenzie from the UN Global Compact Network UK.
Thanks very much, Maddie. I'd like to welcome you all to our webinar, the third in a series on science-based targets being presented by the Global Compact Network UK and the Carbon Trust. We're delighted to have so many people joining us today. Really shows such a strong interest and commitment in this really important issue. Could we move on to the next slide? I'm going to be joined today by Mark Reynolds from the Carbon Trust, from Paola Delgado Luna from the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and Kate McGeoch from SP Energy Networks, and we'll all be sharing with you over the course of this session. Next slide, please. Before we get going on, just a little bit about UN Global Compact. It is the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative with over 10,000 companies and 3,500 non-business organizations participating globally. To join, your CEO needs to make a public commitment to 10 universal principles drawn from UN treaties on human rights, labor standards, environment, and anti-corruption. We operate globally and locally with 68 local networks in countries around the world that are supporting participants with the commitment that they've made. Here in the UK, our work sits in 3 pillars: global goals, business and human rights, and climate action. Next slide, please. And central to our work on climate is promoting science-based targets. So we're very pleased, as I said, to be partnering with the Carbon Trust to deliver this series of webinars, taking a sectoral approach to the challenge of science-based targets. This is the third in the series. Recordings of the first 2 are available on both via the Carbon Trust website and the Global Compact. And of course, the future ones will be recorded as well. And we would really urge you to help spread the word. If you have friends, family, or colleagues in the construction sector, finance sector, or retail and manufacturing sectors, they might very well be interested in joining one of our future sessions. Next slide, please. And finally, from me, I'd just like to tell you about an important campaign that the Global Compact Science-Based Targets Initiative and We Mean Business are leading, called Business Ambition for 1.5 Degrees, an urgent call to action on climate change. Over the past several years, we've seen growth in science-based target setting, and there are now over 800 companies that have committed to setting science-based targets. It is clearly the most effective way for companies to align their climate goals with the Paris Accord. It's not just about, more and more we're hearing about net zero commitments, and that's really critically important. But even more so is the pathway to getting there. And science-based targets is really the only way to be on a pathway that will lead to effective net zero and a truly effective contribution to fighting climate change. So we hope you will be interested in looking at that further and joining this important campaign. And now I'm going to pass on to Mark to tell you a little bit about the Carbon Trust and then get stuck into our program. So next slide, please.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Good morning, everyone. So yeah, my name's Mark Reynolds. I'm an account director with the Carbon Trust. Been with the Carbon Trust just over 7 years. I lead our work on the utility sector, and I've been working on science-based targets for pretty much the last 4 years with the Carbon Trust. I'm going to talk a little bit about the work we've been doing. Just a quick introduction to the Carbon Trust in terms of the work we do. So these days we continue to grow. We're 220 employees across the globe, operating from regional offices throughout the world. We broadly cover 3 areas that we work in. So we work with businesses and governments to advise them around sustainability and climate change. That work includes target setting, net zero, science-based targets, strategy, and achievement of those targets. We also do a lot of work around verification, measurement, certification of sustainability and environmental KPIs. A lot of that work around carbon, but also other environmental KPIs. And thirdly, we continue to work a lot around future energy systems. So looking at addressing a lot of the challenges as we move to a low carbon world around the introduction of technologies like energy storage, hydrogen economy, etc. So 3 areas broadly. In terms of science-based targets, next slide. Thank you. So we've been working, I already mentioned, we've been working around working with science-based targets and helping businesses and governments to set science-based targets across the last 4 years, really since the Paris Agreement. And during that time, we've worked with more than 85 companies to help them set targets across all sectors of the economy. So you see some of the names up on the slide there. Some companies were quite early into the area of science-based targets. So some of the companies on there like BT, AXA and Carlsberg set targets more than 3 years ago. And then we've got a number of companies, particularly in the energy and utility sector, that have come to set science-based targets more recently. And we'll talk more about those as we go through the webinar today. Next slide, please. So in terms of the agenda for today and what we're going to cover, so we're going to talk about setting science-based targets, some background on that. We're going to talk through some of the methodologies and approaches and our experience in working with the energy and utilities sector. We'll talk about the requirements for setting targets outside your own boundary to cover scope 3, which can be quite a complex area. We'll talk about the challenges and opportunities of setting a target. So how would you go about doing it, and some of the things you need to do, prerequisites ahead of doing that work. And then some practical tips on how to get started for those of you that haven't yet set targets in your own organization. And as we've already said at the start of the presentation, if you have questions, please log those using the questions box on the screen. Next slide, thank you. So just a bit of background in terms of climate science. So I think well known that in terms of where we are today, global temperatures have risen by more than 1 degree since pre-industrial times. We also know that across the last 20 years, we've seen 14 of the 15 hottest years on record since 2000. So clearly the pace of global warming continues to increase. We also know there was quite an interesting piece came out a few weeks ago by Carbon Brief about the impact of the global pandemic on carbon emissions this year. And there's various projections in terms of exactly what the impact will be, but the work that's been done to date by Carbon Brief, I think also the IEA, is suggesting a reduction this year of around about 7%. So just to put that into context, to actually hit a 1.5 degree target, we would actually need to hit that level of reduction for the next 10 years running. So hopefully that puts it in context in terms of what we need to do to align to a 1.5 degree world. Next slide, please. So just a few thoughts in terms of climate change across the last 12 months even. Seems a long time ago, but back last summer we actually had the hottest day on record in the UK. I think at the time it wasn't widely publicised because it took quite a few days to verify the record, but that was actually last July. We also last year had Arctic sea ice reduced to the second lowest extent on record. We had the second strongest Atlantic hurricane on record, and those records continue to be broken month on month. So next slide, please. Obviously, in the latter part of last year, in January of this year, we had Australian and Californian wildfires causing huge devastation, obviously due to effects of drought. We know that last year, 2019, was Europe's warmest year on record. And again, here in the UK, just in February, which seems quite a long time ago now, we had our wettest February on record, then followed by our sunniest April on record. So records continue to be broken and continually, obviously, driven by more chaotic weather systems driven by climate change. So that's the challenge. In terms of, next slide, please. In terms of what that impact means, we also know from climate science and the work done by IPCC and IEA and others that the significance of 1.5 degrees versus 2 degrees makes a big difference in terms of the impact on global climate. So we need to work very hard to hit that 1.5 target. Those differences are particularly acute when we look at more marginal climate. So when we look at areas like the Arctic, when we look at challenges around sea rise, particularly in equatorial areas, when we look at biodiversity, species extinction, all those impacts are felt very dramatically where we have sort of marginal environments, corals, all those things we know are massively impacted according to the degree of temperature rise. And of course, from those environmental impacts follow social impacts and then linked to that economic impacts. So the effects are accelerated basically as the climate continues to warm. Next slide, please. So in terms of business and the corporate sector, how does the corporate sector address that challenge? And the good thing in terms of what was achieved just 4 years ago is that back in 2015, effectively, the Paris Agreement has actually set out an international ambition for economies, all those that signed up, and then linked to that, the corporate sector, to actually align to set targets that are aligned to climate science. Subsequent to the Paris Agreement, back in 2018, we then had an update to the Paris Agreement in terms of the guidance that came out from the IPCC around limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. That report then led to a lot of follow-up action around the world. So in the UK here, just this time last year, we saw the government declare a climate emergency. That movement has followed again around the world. So many local authorities around the world, most of the local authorities in the UK have followed up that initiative and have now declared climate emergencies and put in plans to address the climate emergency. And then subsequent to that, we had the UK government in last June set a net zero target for the UK by 2050. And again, many governments around the world, more than 15 now, have followed that lead. And many governments are looking to set their own net zero targets moving forward. So a lot of momentum has come from the Paris Agreement, and a lot of that momentum has come from the initiative around setting science-based targets. Next slide, please. So in terms of the definition, what is a science-based target? That obviously has to be a starting point. So essentially, a target is considered science-based if it is in line with the climate science, limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees above the pre-industrial levels, and actually pursuing efforts to limit that warming to 1.5 degrees. And as I've already mentioned previously, we know that right now we're not on track to meet the Paris goals. So if you look at the graphic in the slide here, you'll see that where we are today, we're heading for a 3 degrees warming unless we look to rapidly accelerate the level of ambition in terms of what we do around science-based targets. So that's a quick introduction. I'm going to hand over now to Paola to talk about the work of the Science-Based Targets Initiative.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you to the UK Global Compact and to Carbon Trust for the invitation to participate in this webinar. I work for WWF and I am corporate engagement manager for the SBTI. I mainly focus on the development of strategies, guidance, and training to facilitate the adoption of science-based targets by companies. I think it's the next slide. Yeah, exactly, that one. Thanks. I'll now introduce the basics of the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So the initiative is a collaboration between CDP, the United Nations Global Compact, the World Resources Institute, and the Worldwide Fund for Nature, or WWF. And it is also one of the Women Business Coalition commitments. In the initiative, we champion science-based target setting as a powerful way of boosting companies' competitive advantage in the transition to a low-carbon economy. And our work mainly revolves around 3 main areas. We define and promote best practice in science-based target setting. We do this with the support of a technical advisory group, and this encompasses the development of guidance, criteria, tools, and also sectoral work. Second, we showcase companies that set science-based targets through case studies, events, media, to highlight the benefits of science-based target setting, such as increased innovation, investor confidence, increased competitiveness, among other benefits. And this with the objective of promoting science-based targets and making them more attractive to other companies. We also offer workshops and webinars to reduce barriers to adoption. And third, in order to maintain, to create a critical mass of companies and to mainstream science-based targets, we have developed a call to action. And through this call to action, we invite companies to join the initiative by signing a commitment letter and submitting it to the initiative. From that moment, companies are already recognized in our website. And then they have 24 months to develop science-based targets, to submit them to the initiative for independent validation against a set of criteria, and also finally to ultimately obtain the stamp of approved targets by the SBTI. So overall, the initiative's aim is that science-based target setting will become standard business practice and that corporations will play a major role in driving down global GHG emissions. And as mentioned before, science-based targets are targets adopted by companies to reduce GHG emissions in line with what the latest climate science says it is necessary to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. But it is important to say that science-based targets are considered the various GHG reduction actionable targets or milestones every 5 to 15 years that a company must set in order to maintain a consistent trajectory towards net zero emissions or even zero emissions in the second half of the century. So basically, science-based targets provide direction of travel to a company. And companies are also welcome to set long-term targets along their interim science-based targets. So I'll speak a little bit about the criteria to validate targets. There are main criteria or core criteria from which sub-criteria derives. and I invite you to consult the extensive document in our website. So we have criteria for Scope 1 and 2 emissions. Companies need to set Scope 1 and 2 emissions that cover most or the majority of these emissions with a maximum exclusion of 5%. And these targets have to cover 5 to 15 years into the future from the date that the target is submitted to the initiative for review. The minimum level of ambition since October last year is well below 2 degrees. So previously it was 2 degrees, the minimum, and now the minimum is well below 2 degrees. Although we encourage companies to set targets in line with the highest level of ambition possible, which is the 1.5 degree goal. Companies cannot use offsets in their base year inventories, nor in their target tracking or reporting. So in other words, offsets do not count towards a science-based target. And we also have differentiated criteria for Scope 3 emissions. So if a company's Scope 3 emissions are larger than 40% of the total carbon footprint, a Scope 3 target is required. And the Scope 3 target must cover 2/3 of Scope 3 emissions. It can be a selection of various Scope 3 categories, or it can be even just a share of a single category, as long as it sums 2/3 or 66%. And yeah, in general, there are various methods to model science-based targets. It can be an absolute contraction. It could be also physical intensity with the SDA or sectoral decarbonization approach, which is a method developed by the partners of the initiative. For Scope 3, there are other allowable types of targets like economic intensity and supplier engagement targets. The last one is about when a company commits to engage and to have a certain number of suppliers by emissions or spend set their own science-based targets, and this in a maximum time frame of 5 years. And there is more specific criteria around this type of target and other targets, but again, I encourage you to consult the extensive criteria document. Next slide, please. Yeah, the previous one. Yeah, thanks. So since the launch of the initiative in June 2015, ahead of the Paris Agreement, the initiative has experienced a steady growth of companies joining our call to action with increased acceleration around key moments and events like CDP's deadline to submit questionnaires, climate weeks, climate action summits, COPs, and other events. And to date, we have around 870 companies that are part of the initiative, of which approximately 360 have validated targets. And on average, we have 30 companies joining per month. We're also seeing more and more companies joining the Business Ambition for 1.5 campaign. We have around 210 companies, and these companies are committing to the highest level of ambition of the Paris Agreement, which is the 1.5 degrees, and net zero emissions by no later than 2050. And we have a mix of sectors, including high emitting industries. We have many power generators. We have iron and steel, cement, chemicals, and others. And we hope to keep bringing in major players in these sectors. However, the initiative welcomes the commitments and the targets of all types of companies and company sizes as well. So if you're interested in learning more about the progress of the initiative, I recommend you to read the progress report that we launched last year at COP. For transparency to our stakeholders, we are now going to release this report on an annual basis. So I think that's all from me. I will now hand it over to Kate.
Hi, everybody.
It's back to me, actually, I think.
Good. I was slightly confused there too. Thanks, Mark.
It's back to me, yeah. So it's Mark. So yeah, just so thanks, Paola. Yeah, just to talk a little bit about what's going on within the sector, within the energy and utility sector, relating to science-based targets. So 38 companies to date have committed to science-based targets and signed up on the Science-Based Targets Initiative webpage. Of those, just around half have actually had their targets approved. And there's a set of logos there with examples of some of the companies that either have set targets or are in the process of doing that. And you'll see a variety of companies on there. So some sort of vertically integrated energy companies, big six type companies, and others that will specialize in certain areas like retailers or energy network or gas network companies. So many companies now from the utility sector looking to actually align their strategy to a science-based target initiative. Just a little bit on methodology. So next slide. Paola's talked to some of these points, but just to maybe summarize the approaches. So most of you will be familiar with the GHG Protocol. So just a quick reminder, scope 1 and 2 emissions relate to emissions within your own boundary. Typically that's energy within your buildings or within your fleet. Scope 3 relates to activities outside your boundary, so typically associated with the sourcing and manufacturing of your products upstream, and then downstream in terms of the use phase and ultimately disposal phase around your products and services. Next slide, please. And just summarizing the points that have already been made in terms of science-based targets. So the SBTi have defined a set of criteria, which you've heard Paola talk through in terms of the what the criteria you need to meet to have your target approved and validated by the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And those criteria differ according to scope 1 and 2 emissions and your scope 3 emissions. And there's a number of options around how you set those targets that we've already outlined earlier in the session. Next slide, please. So just a little bit very quickly about methodology. So if you're looking to calculate a science-based target, essentially there's 3 steps that have to be followed. Again, all the guidance is up on the SBTi website in terms of more detail around this, but just to give you an overview. So step 1, which the methodologies and work done has already done, is assessing the global carbon budget. Step 2 is to calculate your business's carbon budget. And step 3 essentially is comparing your budget and your footprint. So you can see the analogy in terms of the slides there. So how large is the pie? How large is my slice? Am I eating too much? So how do I compare to that? And there's a number of different approaches and methodologies that you can use, and different methodologies will take slightly different approaches to these steps. Next slide, please. So in terms of the size of the overall carbon budget and how it's used, it's defined by different emissions scenarios. So there's a number of scenarios that the IPCC, IEA, and others have actually put together, working with the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So there is a 2 degrees scenario, that's no longer accepted by the SBTi. There is a well below 2 degrees scenario, often equivalent to a 1.75 degree warming. That is a valid approach and will be validated by the SBTi. And then there's a 1.5 degree scenario. That is current best practice following the IPCC report issued in 2018. That is really what most businesses today are aligning to. Next slide, please. So the 2 most common approaches taken by businesses today, we mentioned more than 800 companies to date, signed up to these approaches. So for companies where there is a sector-based approach, they can follow the sectoral decarbonisation approach. So essentially that is a reduction pathway that's based on emissions intensity. For each company, each company can follow the pathway assigned to its sector, essentially. So the good thing about this approach is it does account for investments already made in terms of the starting point on that graph. The limitation of the SDA approach today is that it's currently only available for well below 2-degree pathway, and there is no 1.5 degree sectoral approach today, although that is currently in development and due to be released later this year. The alternate for companies that can't take an SDA approach is to follow an absolute contraction approach. Essentially, that requires the same reduction pathway for all companies within a given time frame. So that's suitable for most mixed sectors, and it can be used for both a well below 2-degree pathway and a 1.5 degree pathway. And for a 1.5 degree pathway, that would be equivalent to a reduction of 4.2% per year going forward. Next slide, please. So just a few thoughts around setting science-based targets in the energy and utilities sector, again, really based on our experience working with some of the companies we talked about in the earlier slides. So essentially, the approach will differ depending on your core business. So whether you are an energy generation business, a transmission business, or a retail business. And in some cases, obviously, some companies will cover all three sectors. And the guidance is different depending on which sector you work in. So relatively simple if you're just an energy retailer, a little bit more complicated if you're involved in energy generation and energy transmission. So for companies in the energy generation sector, they need to set scope 1 and 2 targets that are at least in line with the SDA methodology. And for them, there is a new 1.5 degree power sector pathway due imminently, so due in the summer. So again, more information on that from the SBTi. For companies that are involved in distribution, again, some specific criteria that need to be followed. So we've done quite a lot of work with both gas network and electricity network companies. So in the case of gas network companies, the main GHG impact will be methane, and there will be a requirement to model losses across the network. And we'll hear more from Kate in terms of electricity network companies to follow in the next bit of the presentation. But again, there's a requirement there to look at network losses specifically. Next slide, please. So really just to summarize, I guess, key points that we've talked about that kind of relate to the sector. So a company must set a scope 3 target when its scope 3 emissions are 40% or more of its total emissions. Our experience to date is that will be the case for pretty much all utility companies. So we will expect most utility companies to need to set a scope 3 target. The scope 3 target must cover at least 2/3 of those total scope 3 emissions. Obviously, you won't know where those emissions sit until you've done the measurement phase. And then, again, some specific guidance for companies in certain sectors within the energy utility sector. So for companies that sell, transmit, or distribute natural gas, they are required to set use of sold products scope 3 targets in line with a well below 2 degrees pathway. So there's a specific requirement there. If you're an energy retailer, it's likely that your main impacts in terms of scope 3 will be category 3, fuel and energy related activities, and category 11, use of sold products. Again, that's based on some of the experience, some of the projects that we've delivered over the last year or two. And then again, summary information in terms of scope 3. So you have a few options, as Paola's already mentioned. You can set an absolute reduction target aligned to well below 2 degrees, or you can look at an economic or physical intensity target, or you can look to cascade your targets into your supply chain. Is it an alternate approach or a combination of the above. So that's yeah, just an overview or a bit more detail around setting targets within the sector. I'm going to hand over to Kate now to talk about the experience of SP Energy Networks.
Hi everyone, thanks Mark, and thank you to the Carbon Trust and the UN Global Compact UK network for inviting me to share our experiences. My name's Kate McGeoch and I'm a sustainability specialist for SP Energy Networks. I've been with SP Energy Networks since 2012 and my role includes managing the continual development of our sustainable business strategy in line with evolving global policy and in line with the needs of our stakeholders, and then implementing the resulting changes within our company, which is where science-based targets come in. Next slide, please. Thank you. So a little bit about SP Energy Networks. We are an electricity distribution and transmission business. You'll see on the map where we're based, so south and central Scotland, parts of Wales and parts of sort of northwest England. We transmit, distribute and connect electricity to and from 3.5 million homes and businesses. That's a 24-hour day, every day of the year service. We take the electricity generated from wind farms and power stations and other utilities, we reduce it down through the voltages and then we transport it through our network for use. And for a domestic customer, the average cost of our service is around about 35p per day. SP Energy Networks is part of Scottish Power Group, which is again part of Iberdrola Group. Iberdrola set their science-based target in March 2019 and activities underway to set science-based targets for each part of Scottish Power Group to recognise the different opportunities and challenges for each of the individual businesses. Our part of the group, SP Energy Networks, has been working with the Carbon Trust to footprint and define our methodology and target for Scope 1 and 2. And we're currently about to start the next phase to look at Scope 3 and the plan for overall delivery. Next slide, please. So a little bit about our sustainable business strategy. We've had a stakeholder-led strategy and supporting business governance in place since 2017. Our stakeholders were very clear that they wanted us to create a very ambitious strategy, so we're continually trying to keep it ahead of changes as they come and keep pushing the ambition. We've got 6 sustainability drivers, which you'll see on the left-hand side. These are developed to both support the global goal delivery and also make sure that we deliver all of the aims of environmental and energy regulators. As a networks business, delivery of a net zero carbon world is now a major driving force for our business. And we do this in 2 ways. Firstly, the biggest way that we can drive a net zero carbon future is by facilitating societal decarbonisation, by connecting renewables, making sure that the network is used as efficiently as possible. And then by reducing our own carbon impact from our direct business. So in line with this, over the last decade, we've connected over 2.5 gigawatts of new renewable generation to our network. And we've also delivered a 34% reduction in direct business carbon footprint since 2013. Next slide, please. So why science-based targets? We wanted to set a science-based target so that we could confirm what our fair share is and make sure that we deliver our fair share in carbon reductions. So the existing stakeholder-led targets that we have are ambitious, but they weren't based on climate science. They were developed in sort of 2016-17 before a lot of the 1.5 degree information was readily available. So the targets that we have in our current strategy are a 15% reduction by 2023, an 80% reduction by 2030, and then carbon neutrality by 2050. 2050, in effect 2045 now that the law has changed in Scotland. So that's where we are. And what we wanted to do was to understand, once we know our fair share, what our priorities would be for carbon reduction, which areas we should tackle first, and the actions required to drive those reductions. We also wanted to be able to drive business change. So we've done quite a lot of maybe the simpler actions that we can do to reduce carbon from our business carbon footprint. But as we go on, the actions needed to drive reductions are going to become much more challenging. So we needed to have a strict target that helped us to stay focused and drive the business change and go through the pain needed to achieve those reductions. We also wanted to satisfy regulatory aims, including the Ofgem net zero aims and the aims of the RIIO-1 and RIIO-2 price control objectives. And actually, since we started to look at developing our own science-based target, Ofgem have included the requirement to set science-based targets within their minimum price control requirements. That's been included for transmission price control so far, and it looks like that's going to also be used for the distribution price control that's currently under development. And finally, we wanted to join a well-recognised cohort of leading companies. We wanted to be able to influence our peers. We wanted to be able to influence supply chain and also our stakeholders to also make changes in what we were doing. We feel very strongly that as an energy company, we should be leading by example. So that's a major driving force for us. Okay, next slide, please. Looks like it's frozen. Oh, good. So I just wanted to give a little bit of detail about what we've learned through the process so far. As I said before, we've worked with the Carbon Trust to do our Scope 1 and 2 footprinting, and we've got a subsequent phase coming to look at Scope 3. So I can only really comment on what we've learned through Scope 1 and 2 footprinting so far. First of all, you need a really good level of confidence in your data before you start. So we had been reporting detailed carbon footprint data since 2013-14 of a standard that was needed for science-based target setting. I think that's really important. You need to have a good handle on data first. You also need good buy-in from senior leaders and your colleagues. On the surface, setting a target might not seem like such a big deal. We set targets for lots of things in the business every day. So there has to be a bit of communication about the implications of setting this target and how the reputational effects of setting the target and the potential changes that setting a science-based target can prompt in your business. Especially if your business hasn't been looking at carbon reduction to any great degree so far. Obviously, we've looked at it in quite a lot of detail, and it's still something that we're thinking, ooh, how are we going to deliver this? How are we going to deliver that? There's lots of questions to be answered that are pulled out by setting a science-based target. Your stakeholders can help your business to prioritise setting of a science-based target. So we have a dedicated group called the Sustainability Stakeholder Working Group, and they're very vocal in driving us towards setting things like science-based targets, and they have a direct influence upon our executive team. We're able to give their feedback to our executive team, which has an influence on decision making. You should be prepared to review your target and the related action plans in future. So this is a live process. We see setting our target as the very first step. You need to be able to be flexible as the science and the methodology matures. So for example, we are using the absolute contraction method for just now, as Mark mentioned earlier, and we'll be reviewing our methodology and our target and our action plan once more sector-specific methodologies in place for 1.5 degrees. Target years also matter. So we discussed target years at length. There's lots of different ways to cut it. And what we decided was that we wanted to align them with key internal and external dates, for us aligned with price control dates, essentially. As that will increase our chances of success, as we develop our price control plans, we need to develop those plans to deliver what we need to deliver for a science-based target, and price controls are set in periods of years. So by the end of the next price control, we want to be very close to delivering our targets. And finally, this is one for electricity networks companies and potentially a little bit for gas. The inclusion of carbon impact from losses is quite challenging for networks businesses. So electricity lost from the network obviously has a carbon intensity to it, and that carbon impact makes up around about 95% of our total business carbon footprint. But it's predominantly driven by UK grid mix, so the amount of renewables that are on the grid, which we do have some influence over. As I said before, we connect renewables onto our network, but it's not fully within our control. And currently, only the two most aggressive national decarbonisation scenarios will deliver the grid mix that we would need to meet our science-based targets by our target year. So that's kind of thrown up quite a lot of questions for us. I think that's going to change fairly soon. It looks like the 2020 future energy scenarios will include projections of the grid decarbonisation required for the UK to meet net zero by 2050, which will have an impact on how achievable our science-based targets are. That being said, everybody setting a science-based target will have areas of their footprint that they're not fully in control of, and obviously you need to include scope 3, which is again an area that you don't necessarily have complete control of. So I think we're all in the same boat to different degrees on these impacts, and that shouldn't stop you from going for it and setting a science-based target. So that's all for me. I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. That was a really detailed case study, so very relevant, obviously, to the sector. So hopefully everyone found that useful. Just got a very quick wrap-up slide, and then we will move to questions. So if you haven't already logged a question, please do so. So really just to summarise, I guess, in terms of what we've covered on the webinar. So as you've heard, over 870 companies now already have signed up to SBTI, and the pace of companies joining continues to accelerate. And already 38 committed from the energy and utilities sector, and many more, as we heard, working on targets and looking to join the Science-Based Targets Initiative and make that commitment. In terms of what's important, so you heard from Kate around measurement. So we would emphasize that the first phase before you set targets is about having good confidence in your data, both your scope 1 and 2 data, which most companies will usually have a good handle on, but also your scope 3 data, since Science-Based Targets Initiative in most cases will require you to set scope 3 targets. In terms of the approach and the methodology, that will depend on the nature of your business, as we've heard during the webinar, depending on exactly which part of the kind of energy value chain you sit within. However, we do know from companies that we work with to date that for many companies, the key categories in terms of scope 3 will relate to fuel and energy related activities, and also use of sold products, so particularly obviously gas sold out to customers. And in terms of best practice, today and really ever since the guidance come out from IPCC at the back end of 2018, alignment to best practice means in terms of target setting, you need to be looking at the latest guidance, and you need to be making a commitment to set a target aligned to 1.5 degrees. That's what most companies today are doing. So that concludes the webinar. So I'll hand back to Maddie and the team to manage questions.
Great, thank you everyone. So as mentioned, if you do have any questions, then please type these into the questions pane on the right hand side of your screen. We've had a number come in during the presentation, and so we're able to ask these to all of our speakers. So our first question I'd like to ask to Mark at the Carbon Trust. So this is, if I'm a service company within the renewable energy industry, which methodology should I use, and where can I find guidance on setting a science-based target?
Okay, yeah, the nature of so for any company looking to set a target, it's the step one. It's really about understanding where your main impact is. So the first thing you would need to do, either yourselves or with external help, is to really understand your own initially scope 1 and 2 impact, and also your scope 3 impact. So put together a carbon footprint to understand your impact. And then the next stage would be to actually map that against the methodologies that are out there in order to make a decision about which methodology to use. And our experience in some cases, it may be that you need, for instance, if you're following a sector-based approach, the SDA methodology, it may be that when you map your activities, you find that those cover multiple sectors. So it may well be that the approach you'd need to take would be to actually map multiple pathways using different sectors. For instance, you might look at the building sector and also the transport sector if you were running a significant fleet. So until you've done that measurement piece, it's quite hard to answer that question. And it might well be you want help on that. There's good guidance on the SBTI website, or obviously you could come to a consultancy like the Carbon Trust, and we could help with that.
Great, thank you. Our second question, I think this is best to pass to Paola from the SBTI to answer first, and Mark from the Carbon Trust if you want to add anything additional. So we've heard a lot about the energy sector today. To what extent have other UK utility sectors signed up to the Science-Based Target Initiative? And the example here is the water sector. So Paola, do you have any insights onto how many other UK utility sectors have signed up to the SBTI?
That's an excellent question. I don't know it from the top of my mind, but definitely you can visit our website and you can do the screening, and maybe I can do that while speaking. But we have a section called the companies taking action, and you can do a screening of sectors and also countries. And you can find there the list of companies that have joined the initiative. So happy to provide that number in the chat once I find it.
That's great, thanks Paola. So our next question, this will be targeted towards Kate. So in hindsight, if you were to do the process of your scope 1 and 2 again, is there anything you would do differently? And I think you provided some really good insights into what you've learned so far, but what would be your key piece of advice to attendees today within the sector who are looking to set their own targets?
Okay, thanks Maddie, and thanks to whoever put that question in. Would we do anything differently? I don't know that we would. I think because we worked with Carbon Trust and their sort of safe pair of hands and experience doing this, they helped guide us through the process. I think that one thing that's key is internal engagement. So we had quite a lot of engagement with our executive team about it before we kicked off the process. So we had a lot of engagement between us, our colleagues within our own teams in Spain, and also with our colleagues in Scottish Power Group to share our learnings as we went along and make sure that we were aligned. And we also held a workshop with all the kind of key people from across our business. And as we continue, we'll hold further workshops to make sure that everybody's bought in. So I don't know that we would do anything differently. I think one of the challenges was looking at market-based versus location-based, because as an energy networks company, that's a little bit complicated, because you want to get credit for your use of low carbon certified tariffs, but at the same time you can't do that for carbon impact of losses because you're not in control of the mix of the energy going to your network. So there was a lot of chat about that. But actually the Carbon Trust were able to look at that in more detail and come back with a solution that would work for us and would also be compatible with the rest of our group. So that was a challenge that we overcame. But in terms of process, I feel like so far so good. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Kate. We've got a couple of questions that I think would be good for Steve at the UN Global Compact Network to answer. So the first question is, how can we help build business appetite for more aggressive environmental targets in a world of growing financial constraints? And the second question is, how can signing up to the Business Ambition for 1.5 degree campaign that you mentioned at the beginning of the presentation benefit a company who is setting science-based targets?
Thanks, Maddie. Perhaps second question first. It was in Paola showed us some of the reasons why companies are setting science-based targets, and number one was that there was a reputational angle to that, and I think that's really key. To put it another way, I suppose, if you are going out to your stakeholders with a carbon reduction target that's not based on science, how are you going to justify that? And so the same extends, I suppose, to the 1.5 ambition. It's very clear that the science says we need to have a 1.5 ambition. That is what is aligned with Paris. So to fully realize the benefits of a science-based target, it needs to be 1.5. And by participating in this this program, it will heighten the reputational benefits, which I think our audience will recognize. Sometimes when there is an internal conversation to be had, that can be a really powerful argument in favor of action. It's just how it will be received outside. As to the first question, I think it's similar. We can't separate these impacts. More and more stakeholders are looking to purchase from, invest in, work for organizations that are properly managing their impacts, social and environmental. And it's just a sign of a well-run business that these things are being managed properly, and a clear red flag when they're not, that whole range of stakeholders perhaps needs to look elsewhere for engagement.
Great, thanks, Steve. So that does bring us up to 11 o'clock, the end of our webinar. So I'll pass back to Steve to do our final closing remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Maddie. And very, very briefly, just thank you all. We've been delighted at the number of people that have joined today and the excellent questions that you have sent through. Let me assure you that if your question wasn't answered, we will be responding via email to the questions that have been raised. Also, this webinar has been recorded, and we'll send you a link to the recording in a follow-up email. I'd like to thank our speakers, Mark, Paola, Kate, Maddie. I certainly found this to be a really interesting session, and I hope that everyone else did too. If you still have questions, contact details on your screen. Please do reach out to Mark and Amy, and we will be keen to follow up with you. Thanks again. I hope we'll see you or colleagues at a future webinar, or even better, in-person meeting once we're all back to the new normal. Have a great afternoon.